Okay, I think we're all hooked up to the 4 social channels. Hello, everyone coming in from Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Today, we're talking employment with Jane Hatton. So first of all, thanks for joining me, Jane.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
And so, I've been very careful of, I said, I think life has to go on. And I think people online are wanting a little bit of entertainment and a bit of positivity amongst all of this, dare we say, shit show that's been going on. But I think it's still important to check in with everyone coming on today. And I hope you had a good weekend and I hope you are getting on all right. However, this coronavirus is affecting, I think it affects us all in different ways. Partly the fear of health and the health of loved ones, but obviously businesses and jobs have been affected as well. So I think it's important for us both to give that little element across to begin with, Jane. And it'd be great really to hear from you, a bit of an intro for people tuning in, but also how Corona's affected Evenbreak at the moment. And then we'll move on to some more general stuff after that as well, if that's okay by you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Evenbreak is a not-for-profit job board specifically for disabled candidates and those employers who are enlightened enough to know that they should be tapping into that talent pool. We only employ disabled people ourselves. So we have a number of challenges, but also a number of opportunities, I think, at the moment. So the challenges are, like everybody else, financial, because obviously a lot of employers aren't recruiting at the moment because they don't know what the future looks like, and they're already having to maybe lay people off or at least furlough them. So our income is going to be affected by that, lack of recruitment at the moment. Thankfully, because we kind of work on a year's cycle with most of our clients, we're hoping that by the time most of them come to renew, we'll be back into some kind of new normal, and we've got a bit of a cushion to fall back on. So that's fine. And
Good.
the other challenge, of course, is that some of our employers, as well as our candidates, are in the high risk group in terms of getting the virus. So they've had to very much self-isolate, and we're very concerned that they managed to escape this virus, because it would have quite severe implications for them. But we're doing what everybody can do. So we're furloughing a couple of staff, which is good news for them, because they're managing to not work and get a full, we're obviously topping up to the 100%, so they're kind of not working but still getting full salary, which sounds great, I think. Yeah. Sometimes with mental health issues, it can be difficult if you work in something that keeps you going. It's a purpose, it keeps your routine going. And I think if you take that away from someone, sometimes it can be, a bit difficult from a mental health point of view. But I'm kind of enjoying being able to work at a slightly slower pace than I normally would. I'm still at a pace. And having the time to think through maybe ideas for the future, and communicating probably more with people than I normally do, bizarrely, even though that's not in person, but on Zoom. I'm having conversations with relatives and friends I've not spoken to for years, and now we're having weekly drinking sessions, but on Zoom or whatever. So I'm enjoying having a little bit of extra time. And I think for us, and we'll probably come on to this, but I think I'm always a glass half full kind of gal. And I'm kind of looking for the silver linings. I know that that's not to diminish how serious this is and the implications it has on, people who are ill or who have lost, loved ones at all. But there are usually some silver linings to be found if this crisis is going to happen anyway. And I think two that really struck out for me. One is that we seem to, as a society, have finally realised who the real key workers are. So recognise that actually, no disrespect to them, but if a stockbroker or a hedge fund manager has 6 months off, most people don't really notice. I'm not saying their job isn't valuable, I'm sure it is. But if people don't collect our refuse or stack our shelves in the supermarket or drive the food to the shops, then we're stuffed very, very quickly. And I think we're all beginning to, I'd like to think, realize that maybe the jobs that we thought were important aren't so important after all. And the ones that we've kind of dismissed as less skilled, low paid, actually are the crucial roles. And I really hope that that continues after this crisis is over, and that we recognise that the really important people in society are those that go unnoticed, largely, teachers, nurses, cleaners, those kind of people. So I think that's one silver lining that I'm hoping will continue. And in terms of disability employment, I think, lots of disabled people for years have been asking for, can I work from home, please? Or can I work sometimes from home, please? And traditionally, employers will say, no, sorry, your job can't be done from home. We need you at the office. And all of a sudden now, lots of people are working from home incredibly effectively, proving to employers that actually working from home, if anything, makes people more productive because you don't have the same interruptions that you might have in the workplace. And I'm hoping that people who normally work in offices might think, actually, I quite like this. I quite like not having a 2-hour commute that takes all that time out of my day, means I can't see my kids. And maybe after the crisis is over, they'll go to their employers and say, I'd like to work a couple of days from home anyway, even though there's no particular need to. And that will mean, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but that will mean that disabled people will have more of an opportunity to work in roles that they might not have had the opportunity to work in before. It's going to help the climate because we're not going to have the same rush hour traffic and all the rest of it. And it's going to help employers because they don't need as much real estate to occupy, their workers. So I think, working from home is great from a disability perspective, but I think actually from an environmental and social perspective, if we can now convince employers that, it can be done from work and from home, and it can be done just as effectively, if not more so, then that's got to be good for us all. So that's another silver lining I'm clinging to.
Yeah, no, like you, a very glass half full, and there's always silver linings. And I've seen everything you've said. I wholeheartedly agree with, and I think even on the way that people are just having a bit more time and energy to be with family, and it starts to maybe sound a bit hippie, but like to be with yourself and to just have a bit more time for exercise and to just kind of contemplate what is important and not to just be rushing around from one thing to another and constantly on the go. And I know, like, when I do a day trip to London for a talk or a meeting, I'm not just tired that day and on a train for 4 hours, 2 hours there, 2 hours back, but I'm pretty wiped out the day or two after. So my productivity goes down, even though there are times, of course, it's lovely to be in person. Like you and I given talks together over the years, and it's lovely to see you in person and have a hug and those sort of things. So it's going to be a balance, and there'll still be an absolute need for that face-to-face stuff. But I think we'll be a bit more picky and choosy about how much we do it, because like you say, it is possible, and it opens up so many other knock-on positives as well. So I think that sets us up very nicely. Oh, sorry, go on, Jane, go on.
No, I was just going to say that bit you were saying about rushing from task to task. I'm very much like that. And, you try and step back and have a strategic look at your business, but actually most of the time you're firefighting or dealing with, client queries or staff queries or whatever it might be, and you just don't get that time. And I'm finding that I am wouldn't like it forever, but for the moment, I'm quite liking having a bit more time to be able to just think about the bigger picture slightly and think about what might happen in the future, and even start writing my third book, even though the second book isn't published yet. But hey, we've got time.
Yeah, well, as you say, actually, it's around it from a very business point. There's the time for strategy, time for creativity, time for innovation and disruption. Like, do we have to do it the way we always did it? There might be better ways. So yeah, it's not like let's do it forever and not go out, but it's definitely positives while we're in this particular situation. So there's a couple of comments coming in already. So there might be one or two names you know as well, Jane. Ross Hovey saying great guest. So good to see you, Ross. And then we've got, do you know Rich Copson?
I don't think
works. Okay, so he was on last week, and Access Rating is an app that's for disabled to review places, that sort of leisure places, etc., to then share the good, the bad, and the ugly kind of thing. But he very much involved in the disability community, saying I think businesses also need to be more flexible in terms of switching types of role too, rather than just saying what you do can't happen at home. Have you got any thoughts on that, Jane?
Yeah, I think, we talk a lot about job design, and what tends to happen is that if somebody leaves or a new role is created, what tends to happen is that they just drag out the job description and the advert from the previous time without thinking, could this job be done differently, or could it be carved up? And often we ask for lots and lots of varying different kinds of talents for the same role, which rarely exist in the same person, whether they're disabled or not. And I think, for me, it's about looking at the job design. So if you, Ross saying that he's a fellow banker with a B, good, a good one, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's about looking at each job and seeing, can it be carved up into different areas so that you can get people who are really talented in one area, focusing all of their attention on that area rather than being distracted by things they're not so good at, and then get somebody else to do those bits who's really good at those bits. And for me, it's about playing to people's strengths, people want to grow and learn new talents and skills. I understand that. But I think from a business point of view, certainly at Evenbreak, we very much will take someone on in a role, and then we'll discover that their skills are completely different. Or not different, but they have additional skills that we hadn't even thought about. And then we change their role completely to adapt to those skills. And then we look at, job design elsewhere. So I think it's absolutely crucial. Yes, it's not just about where you work. It's about the tasks that you do and the responsibilities you have and the skills that you're using, really.
And I know also, sometimes it can sound idealistic, but to have that, when you have a passion for something, it's better all around that the person works on something they're enjoying. Like, they can have skills and do tasks and responsibilities, but if you don't wake up feeling excited, that's a problem all around from a business and an individual perspective. So definitely. I think I'd add to that the whole doing things that you enjoy doing as well.
Yeah, we have. So as an example, one of our team, Kiana, who's up here, she's furloughed at the moment. She's up in Glasgow. And she was taken on as a candidate engagement manager, a role for which she's very, very good, very, very capable. But actually, her passion is video and making videos. And time went on, and she was making videos for us around candidate attraction. And then we thought, actually, we need other videos as well. And it seemed ridiculous for her to be doing some of the tasks that she'd been doing before, which she could do very, very well, but so could lots of other people. But not everybody has her skill in terms of editing and seeing the creative side of it. So she's moved completely onto doing videos now. And I think it's that sort of ability to be flexible and not say, well, that's her job title, so that's what she does. It's actually being flexible and thinking, but actually they might be good at this, and someone else can do that role. And we've done that with, I think, 3 or 4 people this year whose roles have changed purely because we've discovered they've got other talents we didn't even know they had when we took them on.
Yeah, and I suppose that the physical ability, if we're looking more around sort of health conditions and disability side, it's just having that, what are your strengths, what are the things you can't do? And it might not be that the role is a yes or a no, but just the way you do the role can be altered, so there's so many ways of getting around it.
Well, going back to Kiana as an example, she has the same condition as you. I think you might know Kiana. And
yeah, I know her.
Her love is film. She's got a degree in film. She's brilliant at editing. She's brilliant at coming up with ideas. And yet she's really struggled to get a job in that field because the perception is, well, you couldn't do a job like that with your condition. And actually she does, but she does it differently. So she's not on site when a film's going on all the time, but she can remotely direct the camera person. We can take a photo somewhere and say, no, I don't want it lit like that. I want it lit like this. She can do what she does from up in Glasgow, and we might be doing it down in London. But I think it just takes that that creativity and flexibility to realize that actually this job can be done in a whole lot of different ways, not just the one way that we're used to. And it is that kind of, there are lots of different right ways of doing things. There's not just one, the one that we've always done. We should be very open to looking at alternative ways of doing things, which are just as effective and sometimes more so.
Yeah, agreed. So there's 3 kind of themes or questions I want to make sure we get through on the chat, Jane. So the first really was, can you just go a little bit more of your story in starting Evenbreak? Because I think your personal journey and sort of, you know, the entrepreneurial side is going to be interesting to people as well.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to do that. It's I've always been interested in, well, we used to call it equal opportunities, but, you know, fairness, I suppose, and everybody's talents being used. And long before I was disabled, I was in that kind of diversity and inclusion world and looking at race and gender and disability and sexual orientation and the whole kind of spectrum of diversity. And when it came to disability, and I wasn't disabled then, I found that there were a couple of reactions I would get from employers when I was talking about disability. And one would be, why on earth would I employ a disabled person? They didn't necessarily say it in those exact words, but you kind of knew what they meant when they were talking to you. So that was a bit disappointing, to say the least. And then the other one, slightly less negative, was from employers, we recognise that this is a pool of talent that we really should be tapping into, but we really don't know how to do that, and disabled people never apply anyway. So I spoke to disabled job seekers and said, why aren't you applying to the second lot of people? And they said, well, because we don't know which is which. You know, every organisation says we're an equal opportunities employer, but we know that most aren't, particularly when it comes to disability. And I remember thinking, oh, that's really awful. Somebody really ought to do something about that, and just kind of clocked it as an issue. And then, I suppose, some quirky twist of fate, a bit later on, I became one of those 83% of disabled people who become disabled as an adult. So I acquired a dodgy spine, I think is the medical term, and you know, went through a number of fairly radical spinal surgeries and you know, the usual let's cure this kind of thing that I think most people do when they first become disabled. And then over a number of years realized actually this isn't going to get cured. So instead of spending all my energy chasing the cure, what I ought to be doing is spending my energy building a different life that works around my new disability, and which, you know, which is what makes disabled people such good employees, because we've all had to do that. And so I ended up in bed for about 5 months, which isn't as much fun as it sounds. And I decided, or with a colleague, that actually a job board with a very focused view, so a job board like any other, but not like any other, so only working with disabled job seekers and only working with employers who were enlightened enough to know that that was a pool of talent they should be tapping into. And so what happened was we got quite good at engaging with disabled people, I think because we're all disabled. I'm going to say we, it was only me for a number of years until we grew, and then I was able to take on other disabled employees. I think candidates have confidence in us because we have lived experience of the barriers that they face. And it meant that employers could tap into that pool of talent that we would attract on their behalf. And the candidates were telling us, actually, if an employer pays to advertise their jobs on a job board that's just for disabled candidates, then we have confidence in them, because it's not just a strap line that doesn't mean anything. They're actually putting their money where their mouth is. So it works for the employers because they get the talent they need. It works for the candidates because they can identify which employers are going to be disability friendly, for want of a better term, inclusive. And it works for me because I run a business I love. So it's you know, it was a good thing to do to take off the ground, but you know, it's been worth doing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's the side of it around entrepreneurship. There's it's intrinsic in who you are and what you do, and I think parts of that just come out while we're talking. But I think there's a lot of people going to be watching around the employment side, because I think we've both acknowledged with each other and just in general publicly that not everyone is cut out to be an entrepreneur, and there should be lots of opportunities to be employed. Almost some people seem to become self-employed or an entrepreneur with a disability because it gives that flexibility. But in a way, that's different from wanting to be an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
So definitely. On the job front, I mean, you've touched on some points, but what for you are a couple of the bigger issues for disabled people, but some of the things that they can do? And then in a minute, we'll talk a bit more about the business side as well.
Yeah, I think we did a survey earlier this year, which was around the barriers that disabled people face when they look for work. I mean, we kind of knew what they were, but if we say it, then it doesn't have any backing. So we did, we didn't do it. We commissioned a university to do some research for us. And we were really, pleasantly surprised. We had over 700 responses, which I think is meaningful. You can't ignore 700 voices from disabled people. And maybe surprisingly, the biggest barrier that they faced was the one I just mentioned, not knowing which employers are going to be receptive to their applications. And I think, when you've been looking for work and some of our candidates have for years, and you've always been knocked back, and that at least, a large proportion of those times is because you're disabled, you kind of lose heart really and think, well, what's the point in me applying for a job when the same thing's going to happen again? So I think, advice to disabled candidates, lots of advice to employers on that, obviously, but I think advice to disabled candidates would be, there are ways of testing out a company, a prospective company you'd like to work for, to see how open they are to inclusion. That includes looking at who's employed there now. Are there people within that organisation who are visibly disabled, or if not visibly disabled, open about their impairment? So, if you've got a senior manager who's open about being autistic, or someone who's open about having a mental health condition, that organisation is likely to be safe for you to be open in. So that's the best way, is about, seeing stories from organisations that convince you that, yes, actually they would value my skills and look past my impairment, or value my impairment. I think there are other things. There's the controversial disability confidence scheme. I have mixed views about that, but I think organisations who sign up to it at least have disability on their agenda. Whereas a lot of organisations, when you talked about diversity, they wax lyrical about what they're doing on race and gender, particularly the gender pay gap. And then it's like, fantastic, what are you doing around disability? We might do that in 2024, And so I think, having the disability confident leader status at least gives the candidate some confidence that organisation at least has disability within its diversity mix and on its agenda. And then I'm bound to say, but organisations who advertise on Evenbreak, because why would they pay to put their adverts on a specialist job board if they weren't keen to attract disabled candidates? So I think there are some shortcuts.
A good signal, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, there are some shortcuts to looking at which organisations are going to be safe to work for. And then I think the other thing is, it's massive. For the businesses, it's very much about changing the recruitment process. We can talk about that later. But I think for candidates, it's about really recognising that a disabled candidate, on top of whatever skills they have, which will be as varied and diverse as the rest of the population, will bring added benefit to an organisation. So they are premium candidates. And I think some candidates go for a job thinking, oh, poor me, please give me a chance. And if I was an employer, I'm not sure I'd be really enthusiastic about employing somebody who really feels, well, you'd be doing me a favour if you employed me. I think I'd be more enthusiastic about someone who says, I have all these skills and I have all these talents. And as well as that, I've overcome a number of barriers that I face on a daily basis. So I've developed problem-solving skills. I've developed creative thinking. I have additional skills that I'll bring with me that your other candidates might not. So I think it's about a mindset of the disabled candidate not thinking, oh God, I hope this one gives me a job because no one ever thinks I'm very good, and going in saying, you'd be really lucky to employ me because I have everything you need and more. And I think that mindset about seeing ourselves as premium candidates, if we don't see ourselves as premium candidates, the employer isn't going to. So I think that's a really strong tip that I would give to any disabled candidate is know your worth, know your value, know what you're giving to somebody.
Yeah, no, really well put. It is that, in a way, that psychology, isn't it, of the self-esteem and confidence that you deserve everything that you deserve. And back to earlier, we've all got different skills and talents and passions, but everyone's uniqueness is very valuable, not just to an employer or a business, but to the world. And I think we have to keep banging that drum, don't we?
Especially at the moment. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, more than ever. Okay, well, so we've got a couple of comments coming in here. Tabitha, I'm not going to pop it up because it's probably going to cover our faces. It's a long comment, but to summarize, it's around in employment at the NHS and some challenges. She made a small mistake, and I think that led to them being quite patronizing, that it was her medication that made her forgetful, which wasn't, from what I'm taking out of it, wasn't the case at all. It was just a genuine mistake. And also around having to explain self-catheterization and being concerned around the hygiene, I think, of the cleanliness in the hospital toilet. So I guess that's just basically when issues come up with your employer when you're in work. Have you got any thoughts on how to sort of advocate and to try and improve things with an employer?
Yeah, I think it's hard, particularly in the NHS at the moment, because they're all under so much pressure. But, you know, a startling feature, but everybody makes mistakes, whether they're disabled or not. And I think what tends to happen is that if non-disabled people make a mistake, it's human error. But if a disabled person makes a mistake, it's because they're disabled. And I don't know, I made lots of mistakes before I became disabled, and I still make mistakes now, and they're not necessarily down to my medication. So I think it's about pushing back assertively, but not aggressively, to kind of say, look, yeah, I made a mistake. We're all under pressure. We're in a, really difficult situation at the moment. Whatever your role is within the NHS, the whole organisation is under pressure, and people will make mistakes. And so long as they're acknowledged and there's action taken to make sure that they don't make that same mistake again, they will make other mistakes. We all make mistakes, but I think it is about pushing back against this, oh, it's because you're disabled, or it's because of your medication. And then I think on the hygiene issue, I mean, that's paramount at any time, isn't it? But at the moment it's absolutely crucial, and the hospitals really should be the one that are leading by example here. So I think toilet areas need to be clean anyway for everybody who uses them. But if you're self-catheterizing or you're vulnerable in any other way, you need to make sure that you're not exposed to bacteria that you otherwise, wouldn't be. So I don't think it's unreasonable at all to say to your employer, we actually need to look at the hygiene everywhere within the hospital, not just for patients, but for staff too. That's not an unreasonable request. And just explain what the consequences might be, that they might lose another member of staff through illness if they don't sort of address this issue.
Yeah, and I'm not expert in employment law. It's not my background, but I'm pretty sure, as a general point, there's a duty of care of an employer to just have a safe working place, right?
Absolutely. And then, of course, also adjustments that people might need. I call them workplace adjustments, not reasonable adjustments. But I think having a clean loo isn't an adjustment for a disabled person. I think that's something that should be expected for everybody. But there certainly is law that backs that up.
Yeah, okay. And then John is saying, I think a little bit back to what we were speaking about earlier, but don't you think oftentimes we say it's because you think I can't do the job, whereas sometimes there's a better candidate? I mean, there's a truth that there's a life element, isn't it, that you won't always get the job you go for because that's how it is on the job market. But then I think, just my opinion here, there are times that there is discrimination, and that's an issue as well. And it's hard to define the two sometimes as well.
Yeah.
But I don't know what your thoughts are,
We
Jane.
would always say to employers, pick the best candidate, or the candidate with the best potential, because I don't think, as a disabled person myself, I don't want to be given a charity job. I don't want to be given a job because they feel sorry for me or because they're trying to meet some kind of quota. But I would say for any employer that if you have two candidates who are similar in every other respect, but one of them is not overrepresented in your organization, pick that one. So if you have two candidates that are equally valuable to you and one of them is disabled, I would say pick the disabled candidate, because you'll get additional benefits in terms of the learning of the people around you and all the benefits we know about having a diverse workforce. But it is hard. I mean, we did a recruitment round internally recently. We had 160 applicants for one role, and we only employ disabled people. So all of those 160 applicants were disabled applicants. We had to turn down, 159 of them. And we didn't turn them down because we didn't think they could do the job. We didn't think all 160 could do the job, but there were a good, 25 that I would have been quite confident in knowing that they could have done the job really well. We can't afford 25 of the people in that role, and we don't need 25 people in that role. So you do have to make a decision about, which candidate you're going to choose. In that case, it was not quite so bad because the candidates knew they'd not been discriminated against because of disability, because they knew that everybody was disabled, and so that wasn't a factor in our decision making. But I think it's difficult for employers sometimes who, are accused of discrimination when it's genuinely not happening, but often, it does happen. And we know that because we know that, for example, experiments have been done where people, and our candidates do it all the time, where you send in a CV not mentioning your impairment, and you send another in a CV and mentioning it, and the CV without mentioning it gets far more positive responses than the other one, and yet everything else is identical. So we know that disability discrimination happens without question. But on the other hand, I don't think every time we're turned down for a job, it can be just through discrimination, because on the law of averages, if there are X number of applicants for a job and then only take one person on, a lot of people aren't going to get that job. And when I give feedback, and I know a lot of employers don't, and I wish they would more, particularly people who've got as far as, say, interview stage, I make it very clear. I know you could have, if it's true, I know you could have done this job. I know you'd have been a really good person in this role. I have no doubts about your abilities. However, we could only pick one person. And I make it a point of saying that, because I don't want them to think, oh, I'm not good enough, or it's because of my impairment. Because actually, as far as I'm concerned, the impairment doesn't matter if they can do the job. I'm not really interested in it. I mean, I'm interested in it when we take them on in terms of any adjustments we might need to put in place. But at the kind of sifting stage, it's pretty irrelevant. Can they do the job, in one way or another that's effective? Then the rest of it doesn't really matter at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one quite harder advice to disabled people when that happens is you have to just keep going and keep applying for new jobs. And I think your point about should businesses give that feedback where it's like, you're great, you would have been perfect, it's just there was someone else that beat you to the post. That's back to your point about enforcing the confidence and self-esteem, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And there are some candidates that we've had that, we might not have applied for one reason or another, but the feedback then would be, you've got some amazing skills. I don't think they're applicable for this role, but you'd be really good at X, Y, or Z. So it's not just about saying thanks, but no thanks. It's about giving a bit of value back, because that candidate's taken the time. I mean, you can't necessarily, we haven't done that with 160 applicants, but with the ones that we shortlisted, we certainly went back with detailed feedback on, it's clear that your talents lie in this direction. Have you considered a role doing something, whatever else it might be? So I just think that at least they get some value from the exercise, even if they didn't get a job at the end of it.
Yeah. Okay, and then we've got a comment from Gavin. We are desperate to employ disabled people. We aim for 20% reflecting society, but until we found Evenbreak, we found it hard to find the best candidates. So a nice testimonial there from Gavin for Evenbreak.
It is. I mean, a lot of employers say, we do the right things. We say on the advert, we're an equal opportunities employer. We tell them that we've got the 2 tick symbol, as it was, or the disability confident thing now, or whatever it might be, but we still don't get applicants. And you really have to work hard, I think, to convince disabled applicants who've been turned down again and again and again and again that this organisation is safe. I missed that last comment that Rich made. What was that one?
So I moved it because it was covering half of our faces. But basically, Rich was saying the 2 points I took out was unconscious bias of the interviewer and businesses saying that they're inclusive just for good PR.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other things that came out of this research that I talked about that we did last year, was about the barriers in the in the recruitment process, and face-to-face interviews was one of the biggest barriers. And a follow-on question from that was around the interviewers. So exactly what was just said is that the interview, often a candidate's experiences that they go into the interview room all geared up and ready and fired up and whatever, and they can see the look on the interviewer's face as soon as their impairment becomes, whether it's they speak and they have a speech impediment, it's kind of a, or they go to shake their hand and haven't got a hand to shake, or whatever it might be, they can immediately see the disinterest of the interviewer. It's really hard to shine in an interview when you've got a panel of people who've clearly turned off in front of you. And that's that's
They've
another
already made a decision.
It's about empowering managers and training managers so that they are much more willing to look at the candidate in front of them in a holistic way, rather than that sort of 2-second first impression. Oh, they're in a wheelchair, they can't. Oh, they've got a guide dog, they can't do this job, or whatever it might be. We need to get past that now and actually look at, but what can you do, and what methods can we do to make it accessible for you?
Yeah, agreed.
Saw that from Mark. Yeah, right. You're right.
Oh, yeah, Mark was saying.
Sometimes,
and that tokenism never works, right?
No,
Basically, tokenism is not part of the solution. Tabitha saying thank you for your advice. Gavin, we are keen to get our services into job centres, as we have found that they are really equipped to interact with disabled job seekers. Is this your experience?
It's the experience of a lot of our candidates, sadly. It tends to be very inconsistent. So occasionally we will get candidates who said, the work coach, the job coach at the job centre was brilliant, and they, really listened, and they really gave me opportunities that were relevant to me. But sadly, those are, less common. I think it's not the fault of the job coaches. They used to have disability employment advisors who were kind of trained in disability. And then they gave that role to all of the job coaches. So job coaches now look at all candidates, whether they're disabled or not. So they don't have the knowledge or the background that the disability employment people had. And I do think that sometimes there is a preconceived cultural idea that disabled people who go into job centres are swinging the lead, they're putting it on a bit because they don't really want to work. I'm not saying all job coaches think that. I'm sure that's not the case, but I certainly know there is a culture within DWP. Often, their policies would suggest that, they look at disabled candidates as people who need to be not bribed. What's the opposite of bribed? Sort of punished into getting jobs. If you don't get a job, we'll give you a sanction, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that so often it's a lack of knowledge on their part, and also lack of experience in understanding what a disabled job seeker might need. And I think that's something that really DWP are looking at. Maybe not as quickly as we'd like, but certainly, that's something that needs to change. But there should be Evenbreak posters and cards in every job centre, so that even if a work coach doesn't know what to do, they can give that card to a disabled candidate and say, here's a job board that will work for you, kind of thing.
Yeah, okay. And then Gavin just added, people actually just not been able to get sort of help through the door, as opposed to issues with the coaches. So yeah, we take that point on board as well. Thank you for that, Gavin. So Mark saying, Jane, what do you think about blind interviews, something that is being used in the US at the moment?
I love that question. 2 answers is blind interviews have to be better than non-blind interviews, in that some of the opportunity for unconscious bias is taken away. I know that there's there was an orchestra. This is relevant. I'm not wandering. There was an orchestra who were auditioning for new members. And when they looked at the makeup of the orchestra, it was predominantly white male. And I've played in orchestras, so this is a case study that I'm interested in. And they decided to do literally blind auditions. So the person it was soft flooring, so they couldn't hear if people were wearing high heels. They were behind a screen, they were given some music to play, and they played the music. And all they could be judged on was the music that they played. And surprisingly, high amount of women and people from ethnic background, minority ethnic backgrounds were taken on in that orchestra. So I think the blind bit is good. I'm not a fan of interviews, though. Really, however they're done. I know this, I say this to recruiters and they kind of throw their hands up in horror, but what? But in that example I've just given, would it be better to say to a cellist, tell me how good you are at playing the cello in an interview, or here's a cello, show me how you play it? Well, obviously it's going to be the latter. And I think that we rely on interviews too much, and what we actually find through interviews is the candidate who's the best at blagging at interviews, not the person who's the best person for the job. So for me, I'm not saying don't use interviews at all, although we don't, but it should be much more about work trials, tasks, tests. I mean, test can sound a bit threatening, but just, allowing the candidate to demonstrate what they can do. So, for example, we just took on someone to do social media for us. She started last week. Very exciting. And we didn't say, come for an interview. We didn't even say, send us a CV. We said, here's a task. This is a video that we created last year. How would you promote that on social media to meet our aims? And we told them what the aims were. And then we judged the candidates purely on how they did that test. And for me, that tested the person that was best at social media, not the person that was best at blagging at interviews or had the best CV. And so I'm very much not in favour of CVs, blind or otherwise, or interviews, blind or otherwise. But if you have to do CVs and interviews, then blind is better, I think would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. I love that. So from Rich, I think this sort of moves us on to the other area I wanted to get into, although a bit more specific than what I was going to ask more broad. He's saying, do you think smaller independent businesses are fearful of recruiting disabled people? Think if the buildings are not accessible, they may not be aware of how to sort it. So if you can give some of your thoughts on Rich's question, but also just some thoughts around what businesses can do, just some general thoughts on the business side of the conundrum as well.
I think a lot of the discrimination that we see is around fear and ignorance. So fear is it's going to cost us a fortune. Ignorance is it can't be done. And I think, we need to make employers. So it's not just small employers. We talk to big employers. Well, you see, our office in wherever isn't accessible. And I say, what do you mean by it's not? Well, you couldn't get a wheelchair in there. Okay, but 96% of disabled people don't use wheelchairs. What about them? Oh. And it's that kind of assumption and that perception that all disabled people use wheelchairs, and I know obviously a lot do, and that all disabled people have no work experience and no skills. And I think we have to get over that mindset, because actually, I won't name them who it is, but a huge hospitality company that has hotels and restaurants and coffee shops and goodness knows what else. Their senior HR manager said to me, admittedly a few years ago, when I was telling her about Evenbreak, she said, well, it's all very well, she said, and it's great what you do, but I can't see how someone in a wheelchair could wait at tables. So I said, well, A, what about the other 96% of disabled people who aren't using wheelchairs? And B, in your organisation, is that really the only job? What about your IT department, your marketing department, your HR department, all the rest of it? Yeah. So I think it is about giving employers confidence that actually nearly every impairment they will be able to accommodate, either because it's just flexible working or because someone can work from home instead of going into an inaccessible office. It's usually pretty easy to do. Or if it's something that's more complicated, there's access to work, and access to work will pay for it. It's not quick, but it happens. So you can, access to work for those who don't know, and I'm sure everybody does. It's a government scheme where disabled people themselves can apply to for any adaptations or support they might need in work. So it could be, assistive technology, it could be a bigger monitor, it could be a support worker, it could be a British Sign Language interpreter, it could be transport to and from work or within work. So I think, I don't think we know enough about that as disabled people, but I don't think employers do either. And, I will say to big and small employers, most disabled people won't need what you think they need. And there are all sorts of, funny stories. I mean, I'm sure this is anecdotal, but I love it anyway, about the company that employed a guy in a wheelchair. And before he started, they said, "You won't be able to reach the lift buttons. What are we going to do?" So they changed all the lifts so that all the buttons were lower down. And he turned up on his first day with a long stick with a rubber tip on the end and said, "Oh, I won't need this then." I mean, I'm sure that's not true. Oh, it might be true, but I'd love it to be true. But it could be, couldn't it? Because I think sometimes this is going to be really hard and complicated and expensive. And, often it's not expensive or hard at all. Sometimes it might just be keeping the walkways in the office clear so that blind people don't trip up over things. It's not usually hard, but I think it is about getting employers to recognise that disability comes in many, many forms. Barriers come in many, many forms. Most of them are really easy to overcome. And if they're not, then you've got access to work.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely a whole sort of, I don't know about maybe on the Daily Sib, maybe it's more like a webinar, but I think there's something about access to work that people really need to get it from both sides. Because I know there are, as with all government funding, there's obviously a form and an assessment, and you have to get through the hoops, and it's not always as straightforward as it could be, etc. But in the end, it's worth it for the disabled person and their employer to do it. So I think that people really need to get their head around that.
And there are organisations around that will help you fill those forms in and make that assessment. People who know the language to use and how to do it. So I think you're not always on your own in that case. But I think my personal experience of it is pretty good. I mean, I have a driver because I don't sit for very long. So if I go any great distance, I need to lie down in the car, and it's a bit dangerous to drive a car when you're lying down. And access to work pay for my driver. They don't pay for my car because I'd have a car anyway. But they pay for his hours. And that makes a big difference. I mean, the downside is I have to pay him first and then claim back afterwards, and there's a bit of a cash flow gap in between. I suppose I could overcome that by saying to him, "I'm not paying you till I get paid," but I don't think it's fair to pass my pain on to him. So I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but it's there to be used. And often the funds that are set aside for it aren't used up. So, we need to be aware that, and it's not just about ramps, it's about all sorts of different things like, training, job coaching within the job to when you're onboarded. There's all sorts of different things, travel training for maybe people with learning disabilities who are a bit wary of travelling on their own, learning the bus routes or the tube or whatever it might be. There's all sorts of things available. Should go for it.
Yeah, the solutions are there. We just need, the businesses, which are getting better. Like obviously, Evenbreak has lots of businesses posting jobs where they're looking for more diverse pool of employees, and disabled people just keep getting out there doing what you're doing with the studying and the work experience and the just growing yourself and making yourself as employable as possible. And the two will meet in the middle and there are those solutions.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's been really good. We've had lots of really cool so as I mentioned this goes out on 4 platforms. I think Twitter and YouTube, the viewership's a bit lower until the replay, and on LinkedIn it doesn't come through on the dashboard, so every now and then I just check on my phone for LinkedIn. So there wasn't a specific question, but I wanted to say hi to Ed, Sabrina and Shani. We all know Shani with her work around employment. So hello to you all. And Ed has just said, great idea, webinar on simple principles for accessible office design to help employers understand the easy changes they can make at relatively low no cost. So first of all, Ed, I was going to text you about coming on next week, so we'll get you on the show as a guest. And I think the webinar idea you've got, Ed, we were talking about access to work. For me, that would be a webinar, but it sounds like there's a whole series going to just pop up now from everybody, which is great to see. But yeah, I wanted to acknowledge the people that are on the LinkedIn live stream. Jane, I asked you everything I wanted to, and I know that everyone else has had lots of questions, but is there anything you wanted to end up, just last point, or where people can follow you and find you?
Just to, send my very best to everybody who's in this, we're all in this awful situation. Some are, somebody said we're all in the same boat. We're not. All of our boats are different. If you're living in a mansion with acres of land, you're not in the same position as you are living in a little flat in London, for example.
Yeah.
But just to kind of, this will end at some point, and I do think there'll be a new normal, and I'm hoping that the new normal will be more inclusive, more flexible, more creative, and that the whole feeling of society that seems to have really come to the fore remains, after it's over. So, what I would say to, I know there's so many disabled people out there who've been looking for jobs forever, and it feels like no one's ever going to employ them. It is a numbers game. It is for non-disabled people. It's much more so for disabled people because of the additional barriers, obviously, that we face. But just keep going, and know your worth, know your value.
Very nice way to end it. Thank you so much, Jane, for all your amazing insights and wisdom and advice for everyone watching, and obviously for everyone watching the replay later on. Feel free to send comments on the social media channels, and myself or Jane will follow up with any answers that we can offer afterwards. But yeah, sure. Thanks again, Jane.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.